Feels a little bit like walking down the wedding aisle coming in. Like, okay, music, go, go, go. Well, thank you all so much for having us here. We're so excited. I get to do this panel every year, and it's always just awesome because investors get a different view into new technologies, I think, than lots of other folks. And the decisions that they make about where to put capital have big implications for what kinds of technologies and what kinds of medicines, what kinds of products get developed. So we're really grateful to get to have all of you here. I'd like the whole panel, each panelist actually to kind of talk a little bit about themselves to kick us off, to tell us a little bit about themselves, their firms, and what they focus on. Joe, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I'm Joe Cunningham. I'm with Santé Ventures. We are based in Austin, Texas, and but spend a lot of time up here. I've known Chris a long time. I practiced medicine for a number of years. Left clinical practice. By pure coincidence, the death rate went down in Texas the year I left practice, but hope that was coincidence. Ended up being a chief medical officer for a large health system for a number of years. Didn't get fired, just got tired. Found out that employing doctors is like being on the Atkins diet. You don't live longer, it just seems longer. And so decided to go into venture capital. So my partner was the CEO of that system. He and I left Ascension Health together and joined Austin Ventures. And then a few years later, we did the math 3 times, figured out it was better to have your own firm than to work for another one. And so we raised our own fund and have been doing it ever since. We invest in everything in healthcare. So we do biotech, medical device, healthcare services, and IT.
Wonderful. Roger.
So I'm Roger Kitterman. I head up the Partners Innovation Fund. The Innovation Fund focuses on spinning out companies from the research done at the partners institutions. So from a research perspective, primarily Brigham and Women's Hospital, Mass General, and McLean. And we focus on therapeutics, diagnostics, medical devices, and healthcare IT. The bright line for us is really, do we have some partners technology in the company? And if there is, we often bring in other technologies as well, but we really need to see some of our technology in the company, and we're scanning the system. You know, we're sitting next to $1.6 billion of funded research annually, and looking for what are the best ideas that are coming out of that we think the best way to commercialize them is to start a company, and we invest in that process.
My name is Amir Nashat. I'm at Polaris Partners. We're a venture capital firm based here in Boston with some offices around the world, including San Francisco. As a firm, we invest in both healthcare and non-healthcare technology companies. And we've been involved in a lot of biotech companies here in the Boston area, as well as some important tech companies, primarily enterprise tech companies. And the combination of those two disciplines is, for the last about 15 to 20 years, brought us into what was kind of software for hospitals and now is, you know, kind of a healthcare IT and artificial intelligence and the role of data in both biotech and delivery of care. So I joined the firm almost 18 years ago now, and have been primarily focused on all things healthcare versus the non-healthcare part of the house. I'm an engineer by training.
Hi, I'm Vijay Pande. So I joined Andreessen Horowitz to launch the BioFund. So what we're noticing in the firm is that there's a sort of new type of company being built at the intersection between tech and bio. These companies are built like tech companies, and I think have the impact to grow like and have impact like tech companies, but are in the biology space and healthcare space. And when I say biology, I really mean quite broadly. So some of our companies are involved in RX and DX, but others in terms of even areas that are not parts of healthcare, like new ways to preserve fruits and vegetables without refrigeration. Sort of engineering advances that can now be applied to this space are really happening very broadly. And in terms of this panel, AI and machine learning is a very powerful way to engender an engineering approach. It takes a very bespoke process and turns it into a repeatable one. So much of drug design, to me, feels more like winning the lottery than building a bridge. And I think the more we can make it into a sort of repeatable process, the more that we could build companies that actually have tech company-like behavior, but in the biospace.
My name is Lei Yang. I'm from Northern Light Venture Capital. Northern Light actually is about 13 years old. We are on our Fund 5, managing about $2.6 billion US. Invested a lot of company in broadly 2 sectors, tech, broadly IT, and healthcare. in the artificial intelligence side, we started to look into this space about 4 years ago and have invested from autonomous driving to AI used in sourcing, in diagnostic, in pharmaceutical drug discoveries, all aspects. Personally, I was trained as a chemist. I first got my PhD from the University of Wisconsin in chemistry, and then got into the IT space. Now when I look at it, I suddenly realize the computer science training that I had and chemistry training that I had are both useful now. It's a really lucky time.
Okay, and I want to encourage everybody to submit questions here, which I'll get to sprinkle in, and we're already getting some, which is awesome. So I'm just going to start with a question for the whole panel, and anybody can feel free to just jump in. But to try to get an idea for how much AI really is starting to get infused into healthcare and into early development of new technologies, how often are the things that you're looking at, the new potential investments, how often do they involve artificial intelligence now versus, say, 5 years ago?
So I just went to the HIMSS conference a few months ago, and there were like 5,000 vendors, and almost every one of them said that they did AI, machine learning, patient engagement, and blockchain.com. But when you really talk to them, very few are actually using AI. Most of it's algorithmic. So at the same time that I'm a true believer that AI is a generational technology that will change our world, it's very early with it. And so that it starts with algorithmic technology and doesn't use a lot of AI at first doesn't mean that it's not going to involve AI with time. But we see a lot of everybody says AI, but I actually see very few companies that are actually using AI at this point.
Interesting.
So I sit within a healthcare system, and so what we see is a lot of things bubbling up through the system for applications of AI in delivery of care or in billing and coding, those sorts of areas. And so what we're looking at is less pure play new technologies of fundamental just AI and AI and AI, but are these AI-enabled services or that could potentially be spun out of our institution, either from a software perspective or from a service perspective? We're seeing a fair number of those, less so on the drug discovery side.
I would say on our technology side, for the last 4 or 5 years, my partners have been very interested in machine learning, and we've made, I think, 4 investments now in deep machine learning technologies for different applications. 2 years ago, about a year and a half ago, we were lucky to invest in an Andreessen Horowitz company, which I think is the only healthcare company in our portfolio that is actually using machine learning on an active basis as the core part of the platform. You would have seen him in the previous panel, Freenome. But I think Joe's right. The word is out there, but the actual true building your company based on the core, I think right now we have one, and we're looking at a second one. So it's farther behind, I would say.
Yeah, for us, this has actually been a pretty major area of investment. I think of the 15 investments I've done over the last couple of years, I would say over half have a key part of AI in them. And I think for what we're looking for, I think this is a critical part to really go from the bespoke nature of sort of science risk towards something which is more about engineering and execution risk. A lot of people, I think, as Bill mentioned, as Joe mentioned, include AI just as a buzzword and throw it on the deck. But I think there are a number of companies that are really realizing that it's an unusual, powerful tool whenever we're dealing with data. And in that sense, while this feels like something new, a lot of this has sort of been building up for the last decade. And it's the confluence of events of the power of Moore's law for compute and storage, and now in the data available that makes this sort of a unique time for it to be used.
We've seen increasingly more companies with AI in their BP. Actually, I realize some of our best investments are not coming, like say, in the last 12 months. Actually, it's earlier than that. It's easier to see true AI companies. Now, actually, we will need some time to figure out. But on the other hand, we do see a lot of really interesting ideas being created by usually a team with a domain expertise and in the healthcare as well as the IT space. So I'll give 2 examples very quickly. One of our companies doing machine translation for healthcare and medical writing for FDA approval type of very extensive documents. I think the results are really amazing. This is purely based on NLP. And they're building one of the largest knowledge graph for healthcare using a new approach that is very different from how other people are doing. It's very manual and labor intensive. This is almost automatic. The other example is a company doing polyp automatic detection for colonoscopy, colonoscopy. What they did is that they managed to do that with very little data. Today, a lot of people mentioning about you need a lot of data. This is almost like a holy grail. Clean and abundant data is not possible. Let's just think about that. You have to work with the problem with less amount of data, but still achieve the results. They've accomplished about 95% of sensitivity and the specificity using only 5,000 images. But they managed to using 5,000 to create 500,000 images. That's with good quality. And they managed to do something else to actually get the sensitivity up. So I think there's a lot of innovations, but it's hard to find those investments as an investor, though.
Is that something that you just mentioned, the idea of data? We hear so much about that, and there just not being enough and not being good enough, clean enough data. Is that something that's repeatable? I mean, is that a technology you think is going to help improve the availability of data?
I actually say, as a startup investor, we invest in early stage in technology. We believe that if data is abundant, there will be less opportunity for startups. Because the data is abundant, usually bigger companies have more data, and they can play the data advantages better than the smaller startups. So I think this is an opportunity for startups to use very scarce data that's available and using their innovations to actually solving a really, really tough problem. We do see these problems almost everywhere, and not only in healthcare, in drug discovery, in medical writing, in translation, in diagnostic, but also in autonomous driving. In anywhere you can imagine, data is not enough. But we've seen people manage to use very little data to accomplish great results. I think that's something to think about, is that don't rely on data, but thinking about how to use little data to accomplish great things.
Yeah, I mean, I would add one thing, which is that I think we're seeing a pendulum swing back and forth. If you ask people a couple years ago, what would be the key advance for a startup, it would be that they have the algorithms. And then the algorithms got commoditized and become available everywhere. And so then it became all about the data. But now what's happened actually is that the algorithms that are commoditized are very much related to image processing and parts that are very different than the healthcare domain. And I think newer companies that have the expertise of deep computer science and deep biology are realizing that they can actually make algorithmic improvements as well. And so I think a pendulum will swing back and forth, but it is an intriguing time to think about what algorithmic advances can now push forward for problems like lack of data and all the other issues that come up in healthcare.
So if the old issue was the algorithms, the current issue, or maybe the now getting old issue is data, what's the next issue for AI?
Yeah, for me, I think it's going back and forth. So I think it goes back to algorithms for the moment. But you know, part of the other issue is that healthcare is just very complicated, and so you have dirty data. You have many different stakeholders that have invested interests to handle things and may not allow you to get in. Healthcare is probably one of the hardest go-to-markets I think of any go-to-market for a startup.
One thing to add is I think Fei-Fei Li mentioned about the 3 pillars for AI, data, algorithm, and computing. And I think on the computing side, we've seen that when there's a new computing resource being created, immediately it's been sucked up. I think it's going to be consumed, right? So the way we look at it is we're also looking at fundamental computing architecture transformations that will enable more faster real-time responses, for example, in the healthcare space. You almost need to think about every hospital like a data center. You probably will have some edge, some terminal, and some cloud, a combination of these in the future hospitals. The architecture of these will be very different, and the database will be different, the OS will be different, the middleware will be different, right? I think because of the so much development in the data, in the algorithms, the architecture, the computing architecture will actually change along with it. And sometimes it may not be fast enough. That also creates opportunity for startups.
And coming from Partners Healthcare, Partners has made a more than decade-long investment in making data consumable for our research base and then beyond that. So we have a certain idea of what data looks like and how data should be used, and then we go to other systems who have also rich data sets, but have not necessarily made those investments over the year, and people's understanding and sophistication around what data means and to be able to use data, there's a lot of variability.
But I think you've got to go back to answering pretty simple questions, and to get a fast ROI, which is what you're looking for with these investments, the questions you want to ask are, first off, we know that we have a very inefficient healthcare delivery system. My number is 40%. Atul Gawande's number is 30% of the things that we do every day in healthcare. He's more of an optimist than I am. Don't do anybody any good. They don't make you live longer or better. And so we need to find out what those things are and quit doing them, quit incenting them. We know that we spend 50% of dollars on 5% of patients. We need to know who are those 5% of patients and what can we do to intervene. And then we need to change the way that we train doctors. When I trained as a doctor, you just memorized everything known up to that point and you were a doctor. And sort of, well, do you use 2 leeches for that or 3, And so we know a lot more than that now. And you're right, you've got to change the way that we train doctors, and a big part of that is clinical decision support. And so I think if you look over the next few years, one of the biggest ways that data and AI can be used is delivering clinical decision support at the right time to the right provider at the right place. And that's going to occur, with apologies to all the Epic people here, not within the EMR, but on top of the EMR. And that geography is a place where I see a real battle going on right now. Who's going to own that geography and be in the workflow for clinical decision support?
And why is it on top and not within?
Because the EMR companies that won the battle won it with 25-year-old technology and have become very wealthy with that technology and don't see a reason to change.
All right, I'm getting tons of questions from the audience.
A lot of Epic users here.
I got to get some of these questions. Okay, what is the scope for looking at applying AI in back office areas like procurement or staff rosters? It might be less glamorous, but it's already done in other industries and less controversial, so it could be low-hanging fruit with more immediate return. Anybody looking at doing that?
So what, if you think about running a hospital, one of the things you deal with a lot is claims data. And how do you get paid for all the things that you're doing effectively? And that's a combination of billing for the right things and coding things correctly. And that's a fairly manual process at this point. And you can think about a lot of AI applications, natural language processing combined with AI to really improve that, both in terms of efficiency and accuracy. Can have a big short-term gain for hospital systems, and it's an area we're really looking at.
Anybody else looking back office?
I do think the speech angle is going to be really interesting. If I look at just even in my own personal experiences, the ability to use AI tools to basically understand what people say so quickly now compared to, say, even 2-3 years ago is marvelous. And I actually think that may be the thing that kills the EMR, is because you now have completely different ways of being able to interact with a health record. You don't need that structured, thing that someone designed 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So I think there's going to be some really interesting hacks that work off of the speech side in terms of collaboration. And I've just seen how quickly that the voice recognition and natural language processing, et cetera, has kicked in, and it's on a very steep curve. So,
and what I've seen is that technology has become so embedded that now we have people who are really experts on the healthcare side realizing what are the real pain points and applying it there. And that's great, because too often I think if it's driven purely by the technologists, they have a cool technology, they want to solve a problem which they think is the problem, but they really don't even know what the problem is. And so I think we're seeing a new generation which will go after these areas that may seem less sexy, but are huge sort of value adds and huge cost centers.
I think that gap between the natural language processing and being able to assemble that information in a usable form is one of the big changes that will take place. So we built a company called Polaris using real-time data, and we built that up to 80 million lives, but you had to curate that data and create systems where you could use it as searchable data. I don't think we'll have to do that. And so you already are beginning to see a lot of NLP processing companies. They always start with orthopedics because average orthopedist only has a vocabulary of about 80 words. And so that way it's pretty simple. And then they'll expand to, real doctors like internal medicine and stuff. But I think that you will see a lot of natural language processing change the kinds of data that we have.
Well, thinking about, go ahead.
The way we look at it is AI sometimes is just a core of a problem, but on the other hand, there's a lot of things that actually wrap around it, actually really create a product. And the product need to be in first principle innovation fashion to solve a business problem. I think there's a lot of the problem in the back office of the healthcare industry, in the hospital, for example, actually can take a really fresh look at it. I met one of the entrepreneurs, I think it was the first time that he explained the problem to me very clearly. Typically for scheduling type of problem is a linear optimization problem. We all know that, and this operational research has been trained on this for many, many years. But for linear optimization, usually the boundary condition is very clear. That's the basic of linear optimization. But any hospital has a boundary clear? No. The forecast, you will never be able to know what will happen in the next week, next month. There's always fluctuations associated with that. So he actually separated this problem into two pieces. There's a linear type of problem using linear optimization, and there's a nonlinear part. This is actually really great for AI, right? I'm really, wow, this is really a really great way to help me to understand how you attack a problem. Separate it into a nonlinear portion and the linear portion, using AI to solve part of it and using linear optimization to solve the remaining, right? I hope to see more entrepreneurs can take a fresh look at an existing problem and start thinking about this from a first principle innovation perspective. I think that will create a lot of value. We've been using linear optimization, I don't know for how many years, 50, 60, 70 years, right? But this is the first time. Now we have a new tool can add to the mix. On top of that, there's IoT that's been created. Sensors becoming super cheap now. I think how do you track your assets on real time? And that become possible. And there's big data, and maybe there's blockchain. I don't know how to fit it into it, but I think some people are smart enough to think about it. But it's really having all these tools that you have together to solve a business problem. I think that's what we're gonna see in the next few years. Yeah.
I want to return to Vijay's point earlier about specific to drug discovery, but I think it applies to AI. My view of nonlinear is a little bit, it's related, but I kind of characterize it slightly different, which is that AI is a powerful way to recreate what humans do. And most of, like, say, drug discovery or being a good surgeon or whatever, there's always what I call the Stradivarius problem. So you could call it the lottery ticket, or you could call it the really outlier person, and there's just a person who sees things and can kind of interpret data and makes really great decisions and finds that one drug, and they're the golden goose you want either in your organization or doing the heart surgery on you, et cetera. And they just have this pattern recognition capability that the rest of us say lack, and that's what makes them great in their field. And if I look at what the AI companies in the tech side are doing, they're evening the playing field very quickly. So they're taking an incredible salesman and they're giving, like we have a sales optimization company uses AI to do this, and they make just anybody straight out of college basically have the skills and the ability to interact with a customer through algorithms that someone with 10, 20 years of incredible sales expertise and training can do. And so what it's doing is taking a huge number of people and making them really good, really fast. And so I think in drug discovery, you're going to get many good chemists, right? Because you're going to have tools that are going to point people in radiology. You're going to get very good radiologists everywhere because the tools will help them get to that level of experience and pattern recognition that otherwise would take 10, 20 years. And so I think that actually the workforce, I'm not as convinced that the workforce is going to get eliminated. I think the workforce is going to get much, much better, actually, in all the areas that our health system operates in. And now the consequence of that, of course, is that things are going to start moving a lot faster, and whether the system is willing to have really great radiologists all the time, not making any mistakes because they have algorithms. So I think there'll be downstream consequences, but if I look at the tech world, they're just, now, I mean, it's funny because I feel bad. My poor daughter, I made her take Chinese lessons, and now it's funny, like I can probably speak just as good at Chinese as her because I can use Google Translate. And so, I didn't do any homework and I can speak almost as well as she can. And that's a little bit the point, right, is that, now everybody can, speak many, many languages and do many, many things with almost no work, which makes us all so much more productive. And I think that's going to be the interesting side of it, which I'm not sure where healthcare, because I do agree with Vijay that there is this kind of lottery effect in drug discovery, but there's also this terrible go-to-market and sclerosis in healthcare systems. What happens when you unleash that and everybody becomes expert very quickly? What happens then? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Amir's point when applied to clinicians is particularly interesting because one of the key issues in America is just access to healthcare. And so if you can have that for clinicians, we're already seeing that AI allows one to take the wisdom of the crowds, let's say in dermatology or radiology or ophthalmology, and allow the machine to have that collective human wisdom. And when you can have that scalable, you can have access to healthcare for everybody in ways that you just couldn't do now, such that in many ways you could imagine AI could democratize healthcare in ways that we can't do without a technology like that.
Vijay, I wanted to follow up on a point you were making and one that Amir was just talking about with drug discovery and the idea that you can make it sort of simplify it and make it a repeatable process, that winning the lottery every time, making it into building a bridge. What evidence, if any, have you seen so far about companies that have been able to accomplish that?
Yeah, so I think in the diagnostic space, and I think the company that Amir and I were talking about, Freenome, is a great example in that normally when you come up with a diagnostic, let's say for cancer, let's take one of the leading cancer companies, like a company called Exact, which has a colorectal cancer test. It's a very accurate test. It's a stool test. I wasn't privy to how they made it, but presumably I had many smart people working very hard to come up with that test. If they want to do a breast cancer test, they've got some major challenges. A stool test probably is not going to tell you anything about breast cancer. It's going to be a whole new, start from scratch, bespoke process. On the other hand, for a company like Freenome, they've designed not a test, but a process to build tests, such that if they had a ovarian cancer test, they can build a breast cancer test by getting more data samples. And so in that sense, that's what makes it a repeatable process versus sort of a more bespoke one.
I think in drug discovery, I think that these tools plus just the speed with which assays are done now, the parallelization, the robotics, and all the stuff that other industries are impinging upon the discovery of drugs, I think it's a little too early because people are, the problem with that process is that it takes a few years to find out if you're right or wrong, and so you need that feedback loop. But as that feedback loop starts to shrink, and I think in the last year or two, we've had a couple of companies get drug approvals in less than a decade, which 20 years ago was unheard of. Right now, people say, granted they're in specific areas where you can do fast clinical development, but things are just speeding up on that side of the house. They're nowhere near as automatable yet as diagnostics and kind of healthcare decision making within a hospital system. But I think if you go forward 10 years, people will see that things actually are starting to speed up because the data sets will start to come back and the machines will get smarter and we'll all get better faster. But that's the hope.
There is a question here just about how you decide to invest in things. How mature does an AI technology need to be so you'll consider investing in it? What do you guys need to see before you're ready to jump into something?
Yeah, so we do very early. We're always the first institutional money in. We form companies from scratch. So earliness is not an issue. What is an issue is the path to somebody that's going to be your customer being willing to pay you for that because you're doing something for them that is useful. And so I would say AI technologies are not any different than any other technology we look at. We're looking for that pain point. John Doerr, who's considered the father of venture capital, always famously said that there's three things you need to decide to make an investment. One is you need a massive pain point, some real problem that you're going to fix. And second, you need the right people to fix that problem. And third, well, there's only two. And so that is what you're looking for no matter what the technology is. Big pain points and a solution for that pain.
And typically, how long toward when you expect to have customers are you willing to get in?
Yeah, so most venture firms are 10-year funds, and the secret in the industry is that you always get 1 or 2 year extensions after that. And so, these things take a long, long time. We all try to get things that we're going to be able to exit in 5 years, and some of them do and some of them don't. But if you're solving real problems that are addressing people's needs, the rest kind of takes care of itself.
And so for us, we live within a healthcare system, so we really want to see that people are adopting it within our own system. They're eating their own dog food. And sometimes we see new things that come out in the healthcare IT area that just spread like wildfire. And you can see that everybody sees, oh, I want this. Yeah, I have to pay for it. That's fine. I'm going to take it. And then other times people come up with what seem like some really good ideas, but they're trying to sell it around the system, and nobody seems that interested in solving this particular problem. And if we're not going to buy it ourselves from ourselves, we know that it's probably not going to work selling it to somebody else. So what we really look for is, can you get somebody within the system and adopt it and show that people really like it? If we see that, then we're willing to take it out to other systems and then create a company around it.
I would say for us, the starting point is being able to do something that is basically impossible if you don't do it this way. And I think then going back to
a low bar.
Well, yeah, under the current technologies, it's this non-linear comment, right? There's just certain problems that are just, hard to solve, with existing approaches. And this is a new approach. And so it's a new tool. And so, Vijay pointed out, like what Freenome does, you just couldn't do what they do any other way. It accomplished certain things, like during due diligence, as we were looking at, the machine had certain insights that afterwards seem obvious, but actually the people looking at the data could not pick up because of the nature of the data. And there were some examples of that yesterday in the pitch, the early pitches, first look. There was a couple of examples where I think in one case, one of the doctors pointed out that they couldn't have seen it themselves when they were looking at the EKGs, or I think it was the sleep charts, the EEGs. But I do want to go back to Leigh's point also, which is solving an impossible problem, but doing it with a really, really savvy group of people. Because for us right now, AI is a term everybody's kind of stamping on their decks. And so when you really dig, though, there's a subset of people that really understand the technology, and making sure you're dealing with very hardcore, good technologists and and really solving the problem in an entrepreneurial, really deep kind of way, I think is fundamental for us. The stage itself doesn't matter so much because these things can go pretty fast, but the underpinnings have to be there.
So I very much agree with the other points that have just been made, but I would add two things. One is that in testing AI early, one of the things that we've really pushed for is giving more perspective tests. So we'll give samples of blood or other things that we can give a blinded test such that there's no way for the company to know how what the answer would be. That's a great test for them such that we can have confidence in investing. But also I think one of the things that I see is that often the entrepreneurs themselves are excited. Because if you're in AI, you often realize it's rare to get a true perspective test. And it's a great sort of gut check to see if it's working. But usually that's not the problem though. That's a nice check. But usually the problem is that, okay, let's just assume it works perfectly. Who's going to buy it? And how's this going to work? What's the go-to-market going to be like? And that's the more complicated thing. And we've worked with entrepreneurs, in some cases, like for months, to try to figure out the complicated way through this maze towards getting reimbursement, towards getting customers, such that the technology often doesn't become the concern. And that's the part that probably keeps me up at night and the part that we really stress a lot.
I agree with Amir that I think is solving a problem in a very unique way. That's something we really look at. Initially, actually, I don't really hope that the entrepreneur is solving one of the biggest problems. It's a problem. The reason I say that is sometimes it's really hard to solve a big problem all at once. It's very hard to predict how eventually you're going to solve that problem. For example, if you want to shorten the drug development cycle from 10 years to 1 year, you really don't know, right? But it's really important to be in the game. So I describe this as like a snowball game. So you have a technology, you build a product, to Vijay's point, for certain market segment and customer. You pack it into a little ball, you find a path, that's the data, roll it. Roll it for a while, you get to another place, pick it up. You get more new technology, new product, new market, pack it again. And then you look at where there's more snow, where there's more data, roll it, right? Only when you start to roll a few tries, you really know the landscape. It's very hard for us to sit in the backyard of your home, say, how do I build the biggest snowball in the world? There's no way, right? You have to do it.
You make it sound so much fun.
It's actually very painful.
I realize he's a good investor because I was just throwing my snowball after trying to hit my friend.
There's a question about innovative business models. What are some of the most innovative business models you're seeing with AI and blockchain in healthcare?
AI, blockchain.
I mean,
Are you getting business model pitches, or is it all technology?
Everybody's got a business model with blockchain, but I haven't seen any that just jump out at, except for Bitcoin kinds of things, I guess.
Any good Bitcoin in healthcare?
One of the areas that I've spent a fair amount of time looking at that I think is an example of the kinds of new business models. And of course, one of the problems is we all are talking about value-based care and bundled payments, but we still live in a primarily fee-for-service road, and a lot of those changes are kind of off in the ditch right now, which has made it harder to innovate with new business models until that sort of sorts itself out. But one area that you can do is pre-authorization. So if you survey doctors, the 1-800-MOTHER-MAY-I is one of their biggest nuisances. And I work a lot with the payers, United Health and Health Services Corp., and they don't like it either. They get hundreds of thousands of calls on 1-800-MOTHER-MAY-I, and 96% of the time they just say yes. But it still saves them money. They've made the decision that program is useful for them and their customers, and so they continue to do it. But when they do it, it's administrative cost, which is mandated under ACA to be, depending on the group, 80 or 85%. If they could download that risk to decision support clinical pathways, then instead of it being in the administrative cost, it's in the medical loss ratio. And so the payer wins big, and it's in the workflow as clinical decision support. It's much easier for the provider, for the doctor to do. And so that's an area that you can really use AI and clinical decision support to create a win-win. And so that's one that we've been very interested in.
But if you make it easier for doctors, is it still going to be the deterrent that the payer wants it to be?
So I think that what they want is for it to be the correct care at the correct time. And so that's what they're trying to accomplish. And so if they do that, where it helps the doctor, the provider accomplish that, they're not really trying to ration care that's needed. Not getting a surgery you didn't need anyway is not rationing. And if the doctor is ordering the wrong test mistakenly, and they can help him, oh, that's not what you want, you really want this, I think everybody wins.
I think my view of blockchain is probably wrong. But as I've been reminded by my kids numerous times, I can never explain it properly. But in my own head, the way I think of it is that it's basically a new data architecture for kind of communal holding of data. So whether it's how many transactions you and I did, or the contracts, or it's basically a different kind of information exchange between people. And it's an old process, and it's an old data structure that people have revamped. The Bitcoin piece adds a little confusion to it, but basically blockchain is kind of a way to store and manage data through kind of a communal architecture in its current embodiment. And it can be anonymous, it can not. And I do think that actually, I'm not sure it's blockchain, but I think it opens up the question of where is all this data that we're now starting to generate on the healthcare side going to reside, and who has ownership of it, who has custody of it? It's my data. If I do a 23andMe, who owns it? How do I share it with you, drug company who wants a little bit of it for your trial? So I think there are some interesting problems that we have not at all figured out on the healthcare side. And I'm pretty nervous about having my payer know my genetic information or whatnot, sharing it with them. So I do think there's some fundamentally interesting problems but I worry that the word blockchain is kind of so buzzy and hypey that we actually won't solve the right problem. We'll just create a bunch of junk out there. So I think my tech partners and Vijay and his partners are more suited to kind of figure out the right algorithms to solve those problems. But I do worry a little bit about just this communal data we're creating and my private contribution to that communal data. Where does it sit? Who owns it? Who has custody? Who's taking care of it? And how will it come back to affect me negatively next time I go for a job interview? So all that stuff's kind of rattling in my head, and I'm not sure blockchain will solve it, but I'm hopeful that, Andreessen, Horowitz, or some of my tech partners will figure it out.
When I think about blockchain, it reminds me of the internet in like '97, and there are a lot of bad ideas that eventually became good ideas. So like in '97, selling like pet food on the internet seems like a great idea, like pets.com. And then like 3 years later, everyone's like, oh, that's a horrible idea. And now I get all my pet food on Amazon. And so, things can come around, but it's 20 years since that time. And so I suspect blockchain will be similar. It's a fundamentally different type of computer protocol is the way to think about it. And with this distributed protocol, purely distributed protocol, you could do things that you couldn't do with a centralized resource. And I think much like the pets.com, we're still playing around, we collectively are still playing around with ideas. And I think some will be great ideas, some will be bad ideas, some will be great ideas that are just too early. In terms of AI plus healthcare plus blockchain, I'm not sure I could speak to something that has all of it, but you could take two, and there's lots of interesting examples. We're seeing healthcare and blockchain where people are talking about marketplaces for data. And actually, AI plus blockchain, we're seeing examples of companies that are allowing you to run calculations on the blockchain. And you could think of this like AWS, Amazon Web Services, except these computers are run everywhere. So it could be like literally there's one in this room. And so the benefits of having a local computation on the edge are numerous in terms of latency and bandwidth. It could be on the local network. So lots of actually really interesting plays about the fact that computers are all around us. And this idea is something familiar to me in terms of the work that my lab at Stanford did with folding at home. And I think we're seeing people from that technology, and actually including people from my lab, building blockchain computers that are these massively distributed computers that'll be really interesting for healthcare and many other things.
From blockchain, I think the potential actually is really, really big. But when we say, hey, blockchain, how do you really put it into a commercial environment? How do you create value? This become a much tougher question, right? So like Vijay said, healthcare, AI, blockchain, if blockchain coupled with any of these, I believe there's going to be value being created. And in the long run, I'd love to see that tomorrow. An entrepreneur can explain to me how to solve the critical problems, right? But it's so far I haven't seen people manage to articulate that. First, talk about value. I think the healthcare data, everyone's healthcare data, who actually owns it, eventually, probably every consumer will have some say on that. Blockchain would be a very interesting technology to enable that. On the transactions with your insurance company, sometimes it takes a long time. If the contract can be right into the blockchain, probably you can get your reimbursement a lot faster than what it used to be, right? These are, I think, on the high level, is 10,000 feet level, it sounds great ideas. But I think there's the fundamental architecture of blockchain, as it creates security, it also creates significant usage of computing resources, power consumptions, and limited number of transactions you can do per second, right? Those are the challenges that you're facing today. So those probably will not be the applications today, like the pet.com many years ago. But there will be applications that probably blockchain and healthcare, blockchain and AI can be used today. You can create the first pack, and then as you go, maybe you will find something else.
The other thing that's an issue that the healthcare system is used to thinking of your data in your electronic medical record as generated by your healthcare services, your interactions with the healthcare system. Now you have a lot of people with wearables and all this other healthcare data, which could actually be interesting to bring that together, and exactly how that's going to work and how you manage that and who's going to be, in charge of saying, yeah, this gets into the health record and this doesn't, how those things interact is something that hasn't yet been solved.
Well, that leads me to another question, and kind of one that's on here as well. This one's about medical devices. The question is, one potentially massive source of quality data would be connected medical devices, yet there don't seem to be a lot of startups tackling this space. How do you explain that? And do you see any startups working in this space?
So I see a lot of companies that or startups that are generating data that they then proudly say, and we'll Bluetooth that right to your doctor. And I think, yeah, and your doctor doesn't want to get that. So I think it gets back to you've got to start with solving a problem. And if to the extent that you're getting data that solves a problem, I think that's useful. But just data for data's sake is not. One of the common ones that I see are the sort of point of service lab tests, which the technology easily exists. Now you can do most lab tests, point of service, lab on a chip, whatever, but it doesn't fit well. There's not a good business model where that makes a difference unless getting that lab test right at that point is important and changes how you're delivering care right at that moment. And so the lab on a chip devices, they'll say, oh, well, your doctor can do the lab test right in your office. He's wanting to get you out of his office and go on to the next patient. And then we worked on one with the Gates Foundation several years ago, and it was to do specific T-cell counts. And they said so that the doctor in rural Africa can have these kind of tests. But when you talk to the doctors there, they didn't have anything they could do with that test in rural Africa. So again, it wasn't needed. And so I think it's the same thing with the medical devices. And we spend a lot of time with the medical device manufacturers talking about that. You've got to have a very short line drawing what you want that data for and how it's going to change an outcome or change a behavior.
Mm-hmm. My view on it is, again, I'm kind of remembering back to yesterday morning with the first look presentations. If you look at where it's going, more and more of these medical devices, to Joe's point, are kind of automated. They're generating data, et cetera. And I think people ask the question, well, when are you going to use all that for like quality? And I think they are using it for quality, but it's just a definition. Right now, it's for a very restricted, kind of outcome, which is, they're probably using, and they will start to use really interesting algorithms to figure out if the tip is in the right place, if the feedback loop isn't working, et cetera. They'll start to share data amongst machines within a given manufacturer, et cetera, within a given imaging modality or protocol. It'll just take time, just like if I kind of remembered the early days of the desktop. It was like all these different applications, none of them shared data with each other, but it just took time for people to say, I want the information in Excel to go over to Lotus or what, the exporting, importing. I think once you get to that level, then you'll be able to make larger definitions of quality. For example, like is this machine doing the right thing relative to, the entire care paradigm for this patient? But I think it'll just take time. I think they are starting to incorporate quality metrics, but we just don't see it because it's within the procedure, or it's within that machine, or it's within that PACS or whatever. But over time, it'll bleed out because people once you create data, it just wants to mix with itself. And so people start mixing different machines, but it'll take time, I think.
Do you all as a panel see AI at some point being sort of touching us in all parts of our lives? I mean, from the time we wake up, we're awakened by an alarm clock that's been monitoring our sleep, using AI to figure out when the best time will be to awaken us. When we brush our teeth, the toothbrush will be sending things to some system that can tell us, oh, you're getting a cold, you better do this, you better do that. And just everything from then when we actually go to the doctor, there will be something that will have interpreted that data so it's in a useful format for the doctor and they want to use it. Are we going to get to that place, and when are we going to get there?
Yeah, one way to think about it is like 20 years is a reasonable time to get all the way there, so much so that you don't even notice it. Because think about what many of us did this morning. We had this mobile supercomputer in our pocket that maybe got a car for us, that maybe handled communication, that did a research into maybe who you're going to meet. All these things are the promises that the internet had 20 years ago, and now we just completely take for granted because it just works. I think on that type of period, AI is going to be something very similar. It's going to be just embedded in our workflow, and we're not going to be thinking about we're using AI no more than we think we're using internet and TCP/IP. It'll just be how things work.
And the other thing I would say is that you think about when you intervene in medicine, like going from when you're sick to when you might become sick, and the data that's required to be able to do that, but it's a much better time to intervene.
I do think the other side of it is like Waze. I don't know, for those of you, I kind of realized, at some point, and the curve hit about 6 months ago, when enough people are on Waze, the shortcuts it's giving you are actually really bad decisions. You actually want to go the other direction because everyone's using that same shortcut. And so I think we'll have to sort out when AI becomes like an overreaction to the problem, and we're all going to the doctor at the same time.
Although with that, you could just say where people should go, and it'd be much more efficient. I think there's a lot of room.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of room.
Absolutely.
Layer Joe?
So I think that it's going to be more gradual that it takes over, but yeah, 15 years from now, I think we won't even think about it. That's the way that care will be delivered, and that will be embedded. If you were an 18-year-old at Kitty Hawk and watched the Wright brothers take off in their first flight, and you said, wow, that's what I'm going to spend my life doing, 20 years later, not much else had happened. I think this will move faster than that, but it's still on the front edge of it.
Any last thoughts, Lay?
I think, Mag, your vision is right. We will get there in some time, and I think, but we need to be realistic about what we can do today, and only being realistic can actually help us to get to the eventual vision that you set for us. I think this is, for me, this is really exciting as an investor for the next 10 years. Yeah.
Well, I have to say, we've got a ton of questions left on here. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but it just shows the enthusiasm for the topic and for the panel, and this was wonderful, so thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.